Hello, I'm Miss Kilburn Bond and I work with all the English teachers in the schools across the Athelstan Trust. In this video I'm going to talk to you about the unseen poetry section in the AQA English Literature exam. So this is a part of the exam where you're going to be given one single poem at the end of the paper that you won't have seen before, and you answer a question about that poem. And the objective of this video is to give you some strategies that you can use to approach that poem, to analyse the poem, and to make sure that when you're writing your answer you stay really focused on the question so you get the maximum amount of marks. And before we look at that strategy, I want to start by just reassuring you that anybody can perform highly in this question. In fact, it's a part of the exam when students generally do really well, because this gives you freedom where you don't have to have spent time learning quotes and preparing context. Instead, all you're showing is all your best literature skills. How well can you read a poem and respond with your ideas about what the writer's doing? And hopefully, to help you feel confident about that, I really like this poem by Eve Merriam. This is just the first couple of lines, it's not the whole poem, but it's called How to Eat a Poem. And here's her advice. Don't be polite, bite in, pick it up with your fingers and lick the juice that may run down your chin. And what she's saying there is don't be scared of an unseen poem. Everybody can get something out of the poem. And the great thing about this exam question is the examiners are not asking you to understand every word in the poem. That's not what this question is about. In fact, it doesn't matter if there are some lines that you're a little bit unsure about. What the examiners need you to do is to bite into that poem and pick out a couple of things where you've got something to say. So hopefully that will take any fear that you might have about an unseen poem out of the equation. And I've taught a lot of students in the past who find it helpful to think about an unseen poem as if it's nothing more scary than just listening to a new song. It's just like song lyrics that you've not heard before. So don't turn this part of the exam paper into something that isn't just a chance for you to shine. So let's get into our strategy then. Step one, first of all, is simply to read the question and identify the topic that you need to focus on. So before you even worry about the poem, just find a question that's on the poem, because that will give you an immediate sense of what idea the examiner wants you to focus on. And once you've got that, once you've decided what your focus is, then step two is to read the poem, because once you've got the focus in your mind, you're going to be reading the poem already thinking about the idea that you need to be looking for. And my advice is that you read that poem at least twice. Read it more times if you need to, because nobody will read a poem once and get everything that they need from it. You need to read it once, let it settle, read it again, and maybe even read it again. And while you're reading and doing those multiple readings, you'll be able to think about how the question fits. And the advice is that this part of the exam paper shouldn't take you more than 35 minutes. So have that in mind, and really good revision practice is to practice in timed conditions so you get used to what that feels like. And everybody's different, you'll all write different amounts in that time, but you get a really strong sense of what is realistic for you. So as you're reading a poem, then one thing you might want to be thinking is, why might this poem exist? If you have that question in mind whenever you come across a new poem, it can be a really helpful way of starting to think about what's happening. So here are some questions that you could be thinking. Does the poem document a cherished memory or a relationship? Is it quite a personal story that's being documented through poetry? Or is the poem celebrating or condemning or protesting against a particular event, an idea, or a social political issue? Maybe the poem is mocking or idolising, admiring a particular personality, a point of view, a wonder of nature, etc. Or maybe the poem's simply just trying to make the ordinary extraordinary. Or maybe it's doing something really profound, like questioning our entire existence and human condition. So in the exam you will have a poem printed on your exam paper. For the purposes of this video, I'm not using an exam paper that's been written by AQA, I'm using poems I've chosen myself. That's because I don't want to clash with papers that you might be using in the classroom. So I've chosen this poem by Caroline Duffy, whose name you might recognise from study before, and her poem is called Night Writing. So the poems are on the left hand side, and on the right hand side you can see the question. So remember, step 1, start with the question and identify the focus, and you'll see that I've highlighted where I think the focus is. So in Night Writing, how does the poet present the speaker's thoughts about writing poetry? Once you've read this poem a couple of times, you'll quickly realise that you could easily write a brilliant essay about this poem as being a metaphor for dreams, but that's not actually what the question is asking us to focus on. It's asking us to focus on an interpretation of the poem where, whilst it's talking about dreams, it's linking the dreamlike sense of where stories might be created to the process of writing poetry. So this is a really good example of why you must read the question and focus on the question before you then go to the poem. So we know that the key idea we're looking for here is anything in the poem that seems to be about the process of writing poetry. And this is a 24-mark question for the quality of your response, and then there's an additional 4 marks for AO4, so that's for your spelling, punctuation, grammar, vocabulary. So once you've identified that focus, and you could highlight that on your exam paper too, you can then go into your reading of the poem. So I'm going to read it to you once. Obviously in the exam you'd be reading it to yourself silently, and then I'd suggest that you pause the video and you read that poem at least one more time on your own. Night Writing by Carol Ann Duffy. Only a neat margin of moonlight there at the curtain's edge, the room like a dark page. I lie in bed. Silence is ink. The sound of my breath dips in and out. So I begin night writing. The stars type themselves far out in space. Who would guess, to look at my sleeping face, the rhymes and tall tales I invent? Here be dragons, children lost in the wood, 3 wishes, the wicked and the good. Read my lips. The small hours are poems. Dawn is a rubber. So hopefully you paused the video and you've read that poem at least one more time yourself and had a think about how it relates to the process of writing poetry. And that brings us now to step 3. So in step 3, I'm going to suggest that you have a highlighter or just a pencil or something in the exam that means that you can select 3 to 4, no more than that, quotations. And they just need to be short quotations that you feel are relevant to the question focus. So on the screen now, you'll see that I have highlighted 4 quotations that I think are relevant to the focus of writing poetry. There are other quotes in that poem that would be equally good. I've just picked 4 that I thought would be interesting to start thinking about. And you'll notice that some of those quotes are just 3-4 words long. The longer quote there, I've included the whole sentence because it works as that question. But really don't feel that quotes have to be great long sections of a poem. It's actually much better if you're able to choose short sections, maybe just a few words. So I've selected silence is ink, the stars type themselves far out in space, who would guess, to look at my sleeping face, the rhymes and tall tales I invent, and then finally I've highlighted that last line, dawn is a rubber. So step 4, there are only 5 steps, so at step 4 you're going to be annotating your highlighted quotations, thinking especially about how the poet has used language and imagery. How do these quotations help you to explore the question focus? So everything you've done so far is about making sure that you are absolutely focused on what the question is asking. By doing the highlighting so it only links to the question focus, hopefully you're not going to fall into the trap of writing about something completely off topic. And annotating quotations, you'll have done this in school many times before, simply means labelling those quotations with your key ideas, what you want to say about those quotes. And because this is analysis, then what you're being asked to do is to think about the poet's methods. What is the poet doing? How is the poet using language and imagery? And what ideas do you have about that? Now, some teachers will give you different acronyms and ways in which you can then start thinking about methods in a poem. Other teachers will refuse to give out acronyms because they rightly think that it's great if you can find your own way through a poem. So I'm going to suggest an acronym for people who want that, who feel they need it, but please don't let this restrict you. It's just here in the video as something that you could use if you find it a bit overwhelming when you just look at a poem and have to think on your own. So what we could do with the poem is we could slime it. And sliming a poem means that we just, as we're annotating, we're thinking about these things. We're thinking about structure, language, imagery, meaning, and effect. And you'll see, if you do look at that like an acrostic, it spells out that word slime. So when we're thinking about structure, you might have chosen a quotation that's going to help you to talk about the way the poem is organised. It might be about stanza or line length, about shifts in the mood in the poem. It might be that you've picked out some rhyme that you think is important. There might be repetition or a refrain, a repeated phrase or idea that keeps cropping up. Or it might be simply about the order in which the poem has been organised, including the first word and the last word and why they seem important. You might look at your quote and think about language. Who's the narrator? How do vocabulary choices add to the poem's mood and atmosphere? Is there a pattern between the vocabulary choices? Imagery you'll be used to looking at when you look at that quotation. Has the poet used the five senses? What techniques has the poet used? Perhaps there's a simile or metaphor or personification, onomatopoeia, etc. to create meaning. What is the meaning of the poem? Is there a message? Is there a key theme that you can identify? And how does that link with your quotation? And then finally, what's the overall effect? What's the overall impression that's left by that quotation you've chosen and that's created by the poem as a whole? So thinking about emotional impact of that poem. And slime being a way of helping you think about the quotation, another technique I'm going to give you to help with this step 4 is one that I call bite back, and it's using the character that comes from computer games of Pac-Man. So if you're not familiar with Pac-Man, you see Pac-Man there on the screen. The point of Pac-Man is as he moves around various scenarios and mazes, he is eating with that mouth and collecting things that earn you points as the player. So if we use this idea of Pac-Man being something that bites into things to get you value, to get you more marks, then we can think about that as a way of helping you in an exam. And at this point, I'm just going to say that lots of the ideas in this video have come from lots of different teachers who I've seen teach, or I've shared resources with them, or I've perhaps heard training from them. So there are lots of different ideas pulled together, and this is one of them. So let's have a look at bite back then. So you can see now on the screen we've got the poem and we've got the highlighted quotes that I've already talked about, and then we've got Pac-Man next to each quote, because what Pac-Man is about to do is bite into that quote to get more value out of it, to earn you more marks. So let's have a look at that first quote then. Silence is ink. And the first thing you do when you're looking at a quote is you think, okay, which words in the quote are worth Pac-Man biting into? And what would be really good is if you're not just choosing one word. So quite often in a quote, there might actually be 2 or 3 words that's worth Pac-Man biting into. So you'll see here that I've identified the word silence and the word ink as worthwhile for Pac-Man to bite into. So when I'm annotating, I'm going to look first of all at this word silence. And I'm thinking, okay, silence sets the scene for stanza 2. It's the first word in stanza 2, and silence is needed for the ideas of poetry writing to arrive into the mind of our speaker. Then I'm going to start thinking about how ink works alongside that. So this is a metaphor. The ink represents the act of writing, and it relies on the silence to exist. Silence is ink. We can't have the ink without the silence, so that's how the metaphor works. And then I'm going to develop that a little bit further. So this yellow arrow sort of suggests that something more advanced is now going to happen with how I'm thinking about this. I think then this builds on imagery from stanza 1. In stanza 1 we had a neat margin of moonlight, a room like a dark page. You can see it's all imagery that relies on this idea of the whole bedroom at night time becoming like a piece of paper and ideas getting to that piece of paper. The act of writing poetry. So the bedroom in the night time creates this magical feel, and that's linked to our title in the poem, Night Writing. So one way to think about this question is to think, could you say 3 things about 3 things. Can you pick maybe 3 quotations, and for each quotation, have you got 3 things that you can say about it? That's quite a nice little neat way of going into an exam and thinking about this question. So you can see there I've got 3 things to say about my first idea. So we're going to do the same again. The next quotation, the stars type themselves far out in space. So I've decided I'm going to have a Pac-Man on each line, and then I'm going to start my annotation. So I'm going to identify some personification. That's the writer's method I want to concentrate on. The stars type themselves. The stars become almost in control of the writing ideas. Then I'm going to develop that further and think about the fact that stars are often linked to beauty. In shining a light in the darkness, could it be that the stars are symbolic of the power of writing poetry? That's a more advanced idea where I'm thinking about the bigger picture of how this quote helps us understand the whole poem. And then I'm going to look at that second line, far out in space. The positioning of the stars as far out in space suggests that the poetic ideas are distanced from reality. So here's my third quotation. So this time I've actually managed to put 4 little Pac-Man around this quotation. So in my annotation I'm going to be thinking, right, what can I say? How can I dig into, bite into this particular word in the quotation? Behind the sleeping face is a mind busy with the technical construct of poetry writing. So for example, the rhyme. So that goes to where the Pac-Man's digging into that word rhyme. Now I want to look at some alliteration. The tall tales, we've got that alliteration there. It's a reminder of the imaginative potential of writing poetry, that not everything that's being written by the speaker is going to be based on fact. The speaker reminds the reader that the sleeping poet is in control of these ideas, so ending that question with I invent, this idea the sleeping poet is in control. It's linking poetry to the power of imagination. And then finally, I want to look at the idea of this being a rhetorical question, because I think that's reminding the reader that the magic of poetry writing is hidden from view. It comes from our imagination. That would be 3 things about 3 things. I've actually done another one because you could, out of those 4 quotations I've chosen, any 3 would be enough, and if you had time you might even be able to explore one more. So dawn is a rubber. Concluding the poem with this line, so this shows thinking about structure, not just about imagery. Concluding the poem with this line suggests that just as a new day starts, the imagination needed to write poetry can be erased in the bright light, the reality of that new day. And it's also a metaphor. Just as the poem started with nighttime, it ends with dawn, and it brings the night writing to an end. So let's develop that a little bit further. It's also a simple sentence that reinforces the sense that there's no going back to the magic of the night writing. There's a lot of certainty in that statement. We feel like there's absolutely no chance that now the new day is going to be an extension of the ideas that came at night. So this whole extended metaphor about night writing then links us to understand what our speaker's saying about writing poetry. So once you've got some annotations around your chosen quotations, you're ready to start writing. And those annotations, obviously you're not going to write annotations in full sentences, they're going to be in note form, but they are going to be there as a prompt for when you start writing your actual answer to the question. And just as a reminder, anyone who's watched any of the language revision videos I've made, you'll recognise these 3 pictures here. Putting words under the magnifying glass or a microscope would work just as well. You're thinking, what is the writer showing us when you're writing? Then you're going to explore, how is the writer showing us this using the toolbox? What techniques and methods is the poet using? And then finally, it helps to then think about the effect. So here we've got our shocked reader. Why is the writer showing us this? What is the reader supposed to think, feel, imagine based on what's been said and how it's been expressed? So let's see that in action. This isn't a complete answer to the question. It's the start. It's the start of the first paragraph and then the start of the second paragraph. And you'll see it's colour-coded. The colour coding relates to the bottom of the screen. Anything that in red is where the essay writer is talking about what the writer's showing us. In blue, how the writer's showing us this, the toolkit, and in green, why is the writer showing us this, what's the impact, what's the effect on the reader. So remind ourselves of the question. In night writing, how does the poet present the speaker's thoughts about writing poetry? In this poem, the speaker describes night writing as the time when their poetic ideas are free to emerge and their imagination can run wild. The speaker sets the scene for this in stanza 1 with imagery that creates an almost magical atmosphere in the bedroom as darkness falls, then giving silence the power at the start of the second stanza, declaring that silence is ink. This metaphor suggests that the silence allows the night writing to commence. The personified stars then take control and begin to type themselves, perhaps reflecting the speaker's thoughts about the power of poetry as shining a light in the darkness. The speaker wants to create a sense of awe about the process of writing poetry, asking the reader with a rhetorical question, who would guess, etc., etc. So hopefully that's just a little snippet of an essay answer where you can see what you're aiming for. Everything there is linking back to the question focus. It's about the speaker's thoughts about writing poetry. The quotations that you can see in purple have been analysed by putting them under that magnifying glass, using the Pac-Man, the bite-back approach, to identify what the techniques are, what was in the writer's toolkit when they were writing the poem, and then what is the impact? How does that make us as the reader understand the speaker's thoughts about writing poetry? And that is all you need to do. Maybe do it 3 times with that idea of 3 things about 3 things. That is enough to do really well in this question. And that brings us to the end of the video. Hopefully you feel that you there have a 5-step strategy which you can use to approach, analyse and stay really focused when you're answering a question on an unseen poem. There is one further question on your exam paper where you will then compare the poem that we've just talked about with another one, and I am going to be making another video about that which you can then watch as a follow-up to extend this idea. Thanks for listening.